You're looking at a figurine from the 4th or 5th century CE, which is said to have been made in Egypt. The image is striking, a female figure bound by her hands and feet, with 13 pins stuck in different areas of her body. She was brought to the Louvre Museum in Paris in this jar, along with a lead tablet inscribed with magical text. This relatively late figurine is called a Kolossos, a type of magical tool popular in the ancient Mediterranean. Today, we'll be taking a look at the uses and contexts of these figurines. Welcome to Hearth of Haimonia. My name is Kate, and today we are talking about Kolossoi. These are ancient figurines used in magical contexts. I do want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. You will see these referred to as ancient voodoo dolls. That is really just people trying to make a comparison towards what you may already have heard of and what you may already be somewhat familiar with. I'm not going to do that just because I don't know enough about voodoo dolls to talk on the subject. You can make that comparison, and if that's helpful to you, then these are kind of similar. The specifics of the spell work and the way that they're going to be used will be different because they are vastly different magical traditions. So what is a Kolossos? You might be surprised to learn, based on the name, that it's actually not a sizable statue. Kolossoi were most often tiny figurines made out of different materials that were used to enact some kind of spell on a person or a being of some kind. They're called Kolossoi because the word originally didn't mean a giant statue. It just meant an image of a human or a god or something like that, some sort of anthropomorphic figure. So the size didn't matter. If it was an image of a humanoid figure, it was called a Kolossus. When the Colossus of Rhodes was built, this giant statue in Rhodes, which unfortunately we don't have anymore, it doesn't survive, but we know about it from written sources. When that was built, it's probable that that's when the word started to mean a large image, a big statue. But for most of antiquity, at least the most popular theory goes, that the word just referred to any image at all. So that's why we call them Kolossoi even though they're small. And these Kolossoi were stand-ins for the object of a spell. Whatever you do to the object, the idea is, it will happen to the person or the being that the Kolossus represents. Now these are a magical tool, so they're not limited to one specific kind of magic, and you'll see them come up in different contexts. Now I've broken them up into roughly 5 categories based on the figures that they're supposed to represent. I think it's just easier to talk about them that way. So the 5 categories that I have distinguished here are gods, spirits like ghosts that are haunting you, the objects of curses, the objects of love spells, and I'm separating those 2 categories, but I think a lot of people would group those together, and lastly, yourself. If you're doing a spell that includes some kind of outcome for you yourself, then you can make a Kolossus of yourself to do the spell on. So as I go through, I'll talk about each of these categories and give some examples. These are just categories that I thought might make it a little bit easier to talk about some of the different contexts. Obviously, all these categories are subjective. Evidence for the use of Kolossoi in the Greco-Roman magical landscape comes from a variety of different sources. We do have archaeological evidence. Some Kolossoi do survive from antiquity, which is great. It's always nice when you get physical spell ingredients or spell objects or magical tools. We also have written sources that are essentially non-fiction sources. So things like the Greek magical papyri that tell you how to make something like this. This is an invaluable resource for us as historians because it gives us insight into what actual people may have been doing, which again is always a great resource to have. And lastly, we do have a couple of fictional accounts, and I'll talk about one in some detail later on in the video. And the last point I'll make by way of introduction is that, as always, I'm just talking about Greece and Rome. My expertise does not extend to other parts of the ancient Mediterranean, like Egypt and Mesopotamia. We do know that these objects were in use in other places in antiquity, but I just don't know enough about them to cover them in this video. Maybe as I go through and learn more, I can make another video, a follow-up on this topic. Alright, so let's get into some of the specifics of Kolossoi. Now, the main purpose of a Kolossos is to act as a stand-in for the object of a spell. So whatever you, the magical practitioner, does to the Kolossus, to this figurine, should, in theory, happen to the person or the being that it represents. This is a principle called sympathetic magic. It's a magic of association. So if you do something on the micro level, it will be reflected on the macro level. And the more closely you can represent your object, your victim, your intended target, the more likely it is for the spell to work. And this is where the use of stuff like tag locks comes in, which I've talked about in another video. Now, Kolossoi can do a number of different things, including providing a vessel for wandering ghosts, pretty cool, representing gods in various contexts, like I said, binding the objects of your spell, acting as a stand-in so that whatever happens to the doll happens to the object of the spell. These are all ways that Kolossoi were used in ancient magic. One of the leading scholars on ancient magic, a scholar by the name of Faraone, has suggested, I think convincingly, that Kolossoi a lot of the time were used as a defensive magical tool, binding your enemies preemptively before they have time to harm you, saving yourself from being haunted. All of these things are defensive magic. So I agree with Faraone when he says that Kolossoi were used defensively. Now that doesn't mean that they were exclusively defensive. When we get into things like erotic magic, love magic, those kinds of things are clearly not defensive, but you are trying to produce an outcome that you want. So how do you make one? Kolossoi were made out of pretty much anything that you can use to construct a little figurine. So the ones that survive are made of clay or metal, but we have written references to other materials like wax, wool, even little bits of dough, pretty much anything that you can sculpt or create a figurine out of. Additionally, you may want to include some other items, not to form the Colossus, but to attach to the Colossus or include somehow. So tag locks, as I mentioned before, we saw one in the tag lock video where you create a figurine and then you attach hair to it, the actual hair of the person that the doll is supposed to represent. And this is a really good way to ensure that supernatural elements that are helping you carry out the spell know exactly who to target. A lot of times you'll see fragments of bone included, and this includes human as well as animal. And then things to write on like papyrus or lead tablets might be included, if not attached to the body of the figurine, at the very least included in the same deposit. And then lastly, and perhaps most familiar to those of us who know what voodoo dolls are, pins to stick in different areas of the body. The preparation of Kolossoi would depend on the situation, so we have a number of different recipes in the Greek magical papyri to prepare different Kolossoi in different ways in order to achieve different outcomes. I think this goes without saying. The other elements of the spell will depend on what you're trying to achieve. It was pretty much never enough to make a Kolossos on its own. You would have had to include things that don't survive in the archaeological record, like spells and chants, although we do have some recipes in the Greek magical papyri that do preserve those kinds of things. They say, make the doll and then say this, right? We have some, but I would guess that this was present in every instance of the use of one of these dolls. And like I said, you can also include curse tablets or other written elements that would just further ensure that the outcome of the spell was very clear, using magic words and symbols to make it happen. Now, where do you put one of these once you have it? Well, all the usual places: graves, cemeteries. In Plato's Laws, he actually suggests that you leave them, well, he's not giving instructions. He says that people leave them. He has seen them in places like triple crossroads, doorways, any of these sort of liminal spaces. As always, there's the option to put this doll in a place where you know it will be discovered by the intended target as a means of psychological warfare and intimidation tactic. And then lastly, a lot of these things would have immediately been burned in some kind of ritual fire. Especially with wax dolls, dolls made of dough. I would imagine you could make one out of some kind of fabric, linen. For these types of material, very often they were burned in a ceremonial fire in order to seal the spell or for various other reasons. So as I said, the Kolossoi represent about 5 different categories of people or beings. So I'll go through each one, talk about it a little bit, and give 1 or 2 examples to illustrate what that context would have looked like. So the first category is gods, little figurines meant to represent deities. Now, this is not the same thing as a little statue that you put on your home altar for worship, or little statues that you carry with you for good luck, things like that. These are just a very small sample of statues representing divinities, because the divinities are somehow the object of the spell, or they're meant to be like an agent in the spell. Most often, statuettes of this type represent Ares, the god of war. The Romans called him Mars, and his jurisdiction, of course, is war, but it's also like rage, unbridled anger, violence, hatred. All of these things fall under his jurisdiction. A lot of these little statuettes show the god Ares bound in some way, tied up at the hands and feet, maybe with pins. And again, like, I found this surprising, but I think that this is not a literal challenge to the god himself. I think this is more of a metaphorical representation where, by binding the god of rage and war and violence, you keep that stuff at bay. You keep it away from you. You make it hard for your enemies to attack you, basically. It's like a protective kind of thing. So the example that I chose for this category is one of these Ares statues. Now, we don't have it physically represented. It's just referenced in a very, very late manuscript. It's like the 10th century. It's like super late. I thought that it illustrated the point very well, so that's the one that I chose. It comes from the Palatine Anthology. Now, the lines I'm about to read are describing something that the author has seen. We don't have what that object is, but the writer says that there's a little statue of Ares that was buried somewhere, and it had this inscription written on the base of it. The report goes that the inscription said, "As long as fierce Ares here has been laid low upon the ground, the Gothic peoples shall never set foot upon Thrace." So this is a defensive, protective measure against invasion and war from another group of people. And even though this is a very late example, it still represents a practice that was in use for long periods of time. We have written references to this going as far back as Homer. So this was a very common thing that evidently lasted for centuries. So that's the category of kolossoi representing gods. The next category is kolossoi representing ghosts. So ghosts wander, right? If they're not properly buried, they wander around, and there's all of these rituals that you have to do to ensure that your loved ones actually make it to the underworld and that they're not the restless dead. But lots of times that didn't happen, especially like shipwrecks and stuff. It's very hard to bury the person. So a stand-in is often used, like a little figurine, or you make a tomb for the person, even though you don't have the body, to try and call the spirit away from the actual body into this surrogate so that you can bury the surrogate and then they will rest in peace. That's one way of doing it. So this is a kind of like a friendly way of using little figurines. The other way that you could use kolossoi to represent ghosts were when you were being haunted. So if you're being haunted, chances are you don't want that to continue and you want to find a way to somehow banish or contain the ghost so that it stops haunting you. And this is where kolossoi come in. You basically coax the ghost into the figurine, and then that figurine serves as sort of like a little body prison for the spirit. And you can do whatever you want with it at that point. You can send it away somewhere, you can try to perform burial rites, or somehow appease the anger of the ghost that's haunting you, but essentially trapping it in the doll means that it's not going to be out and about anymore, which is ultimately the goal. The example I have for this category is one of these types of ghost trappings. It comes from Cyrene, which I'll mention in another example later on as well. Lots of magical stuff coming out of Cyrene. And basically it is instructions for how to trap a ghost inside a colossus and then dispose of it. Basically what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to call the name of the spirit 3 times. This is of course assuming that you know the name of the spirit. If you're being haunted by, your cousin Jerry, obviously you know your cousin Jerry's name, you can say the name 3 times. If you don't know the name, there's other instructions. You basically just call out a generic greeting to whatever spirit is here, like how they do on the ghost hunting shows. Then you're supposed to make kolossoi. Now, again, if you know the person that's haunting you, then you can just make a colossus to represent them. But if you don't know the person that's haunting you, then you have to make multiple kolossoi so that the ghost can go into the one that most closely represents them. The instructions are to make 1 male and 1 female colossus. They figured that that would cover their bases. Now you have to attract the spirit to the colossus, and so you lay out food for it and you continue to call it over. And it's a little bit murky. I was not quite sure exactly how you're supposed to get the ghost inside of the thing. Once that happens, however it happens, then you take the colossus and you go and throw it in the woods somewhere so that it's just away from you. This is like one of the major ways that kolossoi were used when it comes to ghosts. But another way is if you're going to use a spirit from the underworld, or even like maybe not a ghost, but like a daimon of some kind from the underworld, you can create a colossus so that the spirit has somewhere to go once they come back to the realm of the living. Otherwise, they're just going to be wandering around. But you can make a colossus so that they can have like a little body while they're here doing your bidding. So that's ghosts. Up next, we have the objects of curses. And I think this is fairly straightforward because I think if you're talking about like Hollywood representations of voodoo dolls, this is going to be the most familiar. If you want to curse somebody, you make a little figurine of them, you do stuff to the figurine, that stuff is supposed to happen to the victim in real life. This is sympathetic magic. The example I have from this one, if you've seen any images of kolossoi, you may have seen this image. It's pretty famous. This is a colossus that was found in Athens in a grave. It is a figurine made out of lead. It's a male figurine, and it's enclosed in some kind of lead enclosure. People have suggested that this is maybe a coffin of some kind. It's meant to be a coffin, but either way, it's a way to contain the person that the image represents. And we actually have the name of the person that this is supposed to represent, because it's carved right into the leg of the figurine. And his name is Mnesimachos. On the inside of the enclosure or the coffin, there's a bunch of names, including Mnesimachos and other names written on the interior. And just to cover their bases, the person writing also wrote, "and any other advocates or witnesses that may be like helping Mnesimachos out." And from that line alone, we can tell the context of this Kolossos, right? Advocates, witnesses. This is a legal battle. This is somebody cursing their legal opponent. I'm not sure who was the defendant in this case, but the idea is to bind your opponent so that they're not effective against you in court and you win the case. There's many different ways to do this. Curse tablets of this kind show up everywhere, but this is great because you also get a little figurine representing your opponent anyway, so it just further strengthens the spell. Moving on to the objects of erotic spells. This is basically the same category as the object of curses, because love magic is very often grouped together with curse magic because it's basically the same thing and the methods are the same. This example that I'm going to show, which I showed at the beginning of the video, is going to be very similar in nature to the one we just covered with the legal battle. In all cases with Kolossoi, sticking pins into the figurine is common, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you want that area of the body to experience physical pain. A lot of times we'll see in Hollywood representations, you stick a pin in someone's heart and then they have a heart attack. The intention of the spell can be anything. Kolossoi are just a tool, and so how you use the pins and what your intended outcome is will change the way that the pins work. So in the cases of erotic magic, the pins are not necessarily trying to cause harm to all the different areas of the body where they're stuck, but rather they're just to direct the spell to that area of the body. So a lot of times you'll see head, heart, genitals. Those are the most common ones in erotic magic for obvious reasons. The spell is supposed to work on those parts of the body, but that doesn't mean that you want those parts of the body to experience physical pain or agony or some sort of functional failure. Although I have to say, the violent nature of ancient erotic spells, maybe a little bit of pain is intended. I want this person to have heartache for me. I want this person to have a headache because they can't stop thinking about me. Those sorts of things. So the first example that I have in this category, like I said, is the figure from the start of this video. This is most often called the Louvre Kolossos because it's in the Louvre Museum, but it comes, as I said, from Egypt. And as you can see, it's a female figure with 13 pins stuck in strategic areas of her body, with her hands and feet tied behind her back. Are you uncomfortable? I'm a little uncomfortable. This was deposited in an urn. You can see that here, along with this lead tablet with the spell, the accompanying, for all intents and purposes, curse tablet that went along with this Kolossos. And like the example from the legal battle that I mentioned earlier, we have the names of the people involved in this spell. Evidently, this Kolossus is meant to represent a woman called Ptolemais. She is supposed to fall madly in love with a guy called Sarapamon. We have their names written on the lead tablet, and that tells us who the spell is working on and on behalf of. What is so interesting about this particular example is that it very closely follows one of the spell recipes that we have in the Greek magical papyri. And I believe this is one that I talked about in, I think, the Taglocks video. So if you've seen that one, this may be familiar to you, but there is a recipe in the Greek magical papyri to make 2 figurines, one a male figurine representing Ares, again with the representing Ares thing, and another female one representing the object of your desire, and you're supposed to stick pins in it and do all this other stuff to it. Now, we only have the one figurine, we don't have the accompanying Ares Kolossos, so it may not have been following this exact recipe, but because we have the recipe and because it is so close, we can see that this kind of spell was pretty popular, or at least would have been one of the regular types of erotic spells that we come across. And I have one more example for erotic kolossoi. This one comes from literature. You guys are gonna laugh, but it comes from Ovid. It doesn't come from the Fasti though. This one comes from Ovid's Amores. In this particular poem, Ovid is having a little bit of trouble. You see, he's finally with the girl, but he can't get it up. And he's complaining and whining and trying to diagnose what may have happened, and among the things he suggests, he said maybe witches were involved, and he suggests a number of different methods that the witches may have used against him in order to cause his impotence. Now, one of the ways that he suggests is the use of a colossus, and I'll read you the 2 lines that reference this type of magic. He says, "Did some witch fix my name into red wax and stick a needle into the middle of my tender liver?" So he's thinking that maybe a colossus is at work here. I don't immediately understand the connection between the liver and erectile dysfunction. I'm sure there is evidence out there linking the two. I haven't found it yet. Now, I don't think he's being serious here. I think he's just complaining. Nevertheless, we get the impression that this kind of thing was out there. And Ovid is pretty aware and talks regularly about the activities of witchcraft, so clearly he was at least aware that this kind of thing could happen. Maybe even to him. And lastly, you can make a colossus to represent yourself. This comes up in a number of different ways, in particular in erotic magic when you make 2 figurines that are supposed to represent you and the object of your desire. But the example that I'm gonna give is sort of a preemptive magical measure to ensure that you and all of the other people that you're doing the spell with are behaving correctly. So the desired outcome is cooperation in this case. The example comes from Cyrene, again, like the instructions for getting rid of an unwanted haunting. And this is a little bit of a later inscription describing a ritual that took place a couple centuries earlier. So we have to take it with a grain of salt, but the fact that it exists tells me that even if this example is made up, this kind of thing was happening around the ancient Mediterranean. So Cyrene was settled as a colony from the Greek city of Thera in the 6th century, and allegedly when they were sort of ceremonially christening the colony, they all went through this ritual. And the ritual included each person, man, woman, child, taking an oath, basically an oath of loyalty and good behavior in the colony, not turning against the colony, not doing anything to disrupt the activities of the colony, yada yada yada. And this oath was accompanied by the creation of Kolossoi. Now, I don't know how many. I would guess either just 1 or 1 for each person. So however many there were, they were ceremonially thrown into a fire, and the wax obviously melted, and the Kolossoi were destroyed. And the idea was, as it said in the inscription, that if anyone should break their oath and go against the colony, that they, like the Kolossoi, would melt and be destroyed and disintegrate into nothing and burn in a fiery hellscape. That's what the inscription suggests. It's a way to bind yourself in an oath to all of these other people. It's basically preventative magic. It's kind of the same principle as like if you say, you know, may God strike me down if I'm lying. It's to ensure that everyone, including you, behaves in this new city that they're creating. So that's just a little bit about the use of Kolossoi in ancient magic. When it comes to Kolossoi, we have a ton of examples, a ton of evidence, and at times it is hard to distinguish whether a figure in the archaeological record represented traditional sort of kosher religion or this other type of activity, this magical activity. With some of them, it's obvious because they're bound or they're accompanied by curse tablets, but especially in the cases of figurines representing gods, it might be a little bit hard to tell. When it comes to intention, though, these are clearly a separate category from regular religious figurines. They represented beings that you wanted to do something to in some way. For better or worse, for good or bad, doesn't matter. Like tag locks, like curse tablets, these are a magical tool, and they in themselves do not have a particular intention. They're just used to augment whatever the intention of the spell is that you're doing at the time. It's not surprising that people in the ancient Mediterranean used these kinds of tools because, as I said at the beginning of the video, they're still in use today. This is a very common and very clear way of associating a spell with a particular person, enacting in the microcosm what you hope to bring about on the macro scale. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you want to see more videos about magical tools and ancient Greco-Roman magic and religion, you can go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I'm posting videos like this almost every week. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next video.